What's happening in Crimea is really interesting, isn't it? Because they are effectively cutting it off. Fuel shortages, fuel rationing.
The most extraordinary paradox about the Russian war effort is that you've got that sort of awful lumpen, ex-con, drunken contract soldier stumbling to a near certain death. And then you do have people in that system, particularly in the officers and the defence industry, who are smart cookies.
What Ukrainians will always tell you is that whenever we do anything, the Russians then catch up. It's cat and mouse.
Is it possible that the Ukrainians think they can get Crimea back? And what would that blow mean to Vladimir Putin in Moscow? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast Indicators. I'm Matt Frei.
And I'm Mark Urban, and this is the podcast where we look at the signals that analysts watch most closely that suggest significant change is imminent and separate the signal from the noise and the wheat from the chaff.
We're returning to the war in Ukraine again today, and we're joined by our colleague Lindsey Hilsum to help us do just that. There are several fronts to that war, of course. There's the battlefield itself. The Crimean Peninsula, for instance, has come under such sustained Ukrainian attack that fuel has been severely rationed and the peninsula is in danger of becoming a bit of an island. Then there's the economic front. The prospect of conflict with Russia is used as the reason for beefing up defence spending in Europe, and that, of course, includes right here in the UK.
And some breaking news on this front as the outgoing Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has unveiled, many months late, the UK's defence investment plan, essentially laying out the scope of Britain's future armed forces and defence spending. The government is trumpeting it as a boost to defence budgets and investment in things including drones. But many say it still leaves the UK perilously vulnerable to its enemies.
Okay, so plenty to talk about. Are we preparing for a new war here? What does it actually mean, preparing for war? And is it kind of conventional war with Russia? Is it with China? What about war against terrorists? The kind of stuff that we used to be supposed to be prepared for. Okay, let's start with you, Mark. What is your big takeaway on this defence review today?
Well, I think my big takeaway is that when John Healey, the previous Defence Secretary, resigned a couple of weeks ago, saying the kind of money they're talking about is not nearly enough. It's not nearly being spent soon enough on the road to future targets, NATO targets. And all the military leaders agree with me, and it will actually mean cuts rather than has only been increased in the smallest amount since he resigned. So today's announcement is of 15 billion over the next 4 years. The military chiefs had wanted 28. And when Healey resigned, he'd been offered 13.5. So it's 1.5 billion extra. Now, if we get into the really hideous...
That's 1.5 days of the Iran war, isn't it? As conducted and paid for by America.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, Britain is not aspiring to that level of military activity. But, I mean, I think this is a really important moment, actually, in terms of, Trump and potentially future US presidents being far less committed to European security, so it's time for us to step up. And yet at the same time, the UK has been falling down that league of European defence spending and will continue to stay in the middle or perhaps drop even a little lower relative to what the other countries, I know we're going to talk about Germany, Denmark, Poland, the Baltic republics, all of those increasing by greater margins. And so that's that old question then again about influence. Is defence going to be something that helps the UK in its relationship with Europe and the EU? Does it leverage that strength? It's not looking that way. I mean, we were criticised just last week by the Polish Foreign Secretary for not matching words with budget.
Something he loves to do, Radek Sikorski. He's always holding our feet to the fire on that one. Lindsey, I mean, there's so, if you look at defence, the threat of war, there is so much that needs to be discussed because so much is new. There is the nature of the threat. What does that actually mean? There is how we fight those wars. So, the big development is obviously drones, but it could also be, more robotics and more AI. And there's the cost of that war. And what I find so interesting is that here we are arguing about the extra $1.5 billion and is that enough? And we know how much America loves to spend on defense. But the average cost of a Shahed drone used by the Iranians is like, what, $30,000? The same as an electrified Mini. And the drone that shoots down the Iranian drone is maybe $3,000. I mean, we are in a brave new and rather challenging world when it comes to everything.
We certainly are. And I think Yes, you can look at the headline figures, but the real thing is, what is it being spent on? And obviously there is a new emphasis on drones and robotics and, AI and all of this stuff. But the big problem that Britain has always had is how wasteful, how inefficient is its procurement system. And if the military procurement system doesn't improve, then I don't know what's going to happen. I was talking to a chap the other day, and obviously he's special pleading. He does AI drones, which, by the way, are not yet legal within NATO, but he is working on them with the Ukrainians. He says that he goes to the Germans and they're very interested in talking to him about his small, boutique AI drone company. He says he can't even get the Ministry of Defence to talk to him. And yet this is...
Because it's too cutting edge.
He doesn't really know why. He just knows that he can't find his way through the thicket of bureaucracy, and he is British.
Yeah.
And so... and Britain always goes to, its favoured suppliers, all of the people it's gone to over the years. And what I don't know is the extent to which they are, beginning to really adapt to the coming technology. Because when you spend time in Ukraine, as I have, it's extraordinary who is developing the technology. I was in Kharkiv a while back, and we were taken underground to a sort of office, and there were a bunch of people down there who were developing cutting-edge drones. They had been a rock band before. That's how they had got together. And now they thought, well, we've got to do something for the war effort. And this is what they were doing. And they were capturing Russian drones, and I saw they showed me how they were reverse engineering it, and they were developing their own. And so, the other thing which is really fascinating about the war in Ukraine, apart from how they have developed the technology which is now leading the world, is that a lot of this is done with private money.
Yeah.
I know all sorts of people, Ukrainians and non-Ukrainians, who, provide a vehicle here or a vehicle there, or, they're like adopt a brigade, like you might, I don't know, adopt a dog's home or a dog. And they're really helping these brigades fight the Russians. It's a totally different model of warfare, both in terms of the technology and in terms of the financing.
The brigades compete, don't they, for money in a way, and for backers. I mean, you said so many things there, Lindsey. It's difficult to know where to jump in, but I think one thing you did say, which I think is really important. Clearly, as far as the public is concerned, the Treasury and the Labour Party, the MOD spends its money badly. Does it spend it so much worse than HS2 or NHS IT or the third runway at Heathrow? I'm not sure, but let's take for the sake of argument that it has had some stinkers in terms of some of its projects. The astute nuclear submarine project, they're all tied up at the moment. We've bought 6 of them, £12 billion. None of them are at sea. So there are some real problems. I think where the big change needs to happen, and you talked about the big prime contractors, that's where the big change has to come. And I got a WhatsApp from one of our heads of armed forces until a few years ago the other day saying he feels it is going to be broken now. Now, how you get the new disruptor or the new, there are these new contractors. They're building missiles for the Ukrainians, some of it with British money. So there is a sector developing there, but could they build a nuclear submarine or a destroyer? Hugely complex undertaking. Not so sure.
But
do we need a nuclear submarine? What is it? Up 18 to 20% of the defence budget goes on the nuclear deterrent. And I was at an event with 6 generals, no less, this weekend, and nobody liked.
That's the kind of ratio you like.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Nobody was saying we shouldn't have the nuclear deterrent, but they were saying they were looking at the coming world of warfare and defence and wondering, was that really the best way of spending the limited resources that we have? I mean, that's why we're on the UN Security Council, and no politician ever wants to give it up.
Is it not an obvious point as well that in Ukraine, warfare is a very real thing and has been for quite a long time? So when you've got rock bands developing drones, or I remember once being shown a year and a half ago, I wanted to see a drone factory, and they showed me a warehouse in Kyiv full of toy drones, and I thought they were taking the mickey, but actually they were the drones that were going to be refurbished to become anti-drone drones. Yeah. But needs must. The crisis like this is the master of invention. So that's what they're doing. They know exactly what war they need to fight. They know what resources they have to fight it, which are limited because a lot of the money comes from Europe. No money, by the way, anymore from the United States for some time now. And they have a very clear idea. I think the problem with us here is the abstract nature of the debate. So the Prime Minister gives a speech where he says, we need to be ready for a war that will spill beyond the borders of Ukraine. Well, what does he mean by that? Is he actually saying there are going to be Russian tanks in Piccadilly? I doubt it. Is he saying that we're going to have Russian missile attacks on Putney or, I don't know, or Middlesbrough? I also doubt it.
Putney? Heaven forfend.
Heaven forfend. Let's not. Anyway, but the point is, they need to be much more honest and clear about where they see the threat, because only then can they ask us, or our children for that matter, to make the kind of sacrifices that are necessary, but do so without scaring all the horses. But I think that's the problem, right?
I think that's fair. I think that's very fair, and I encounter that, as a specialist in this area, that kind of skepticism from many people. Where is the threat? My response to that would be that we came out of those so-called war on terror campaigns, Iraq and Afghanistan, with conventional armed forces that were completely wizened away. The things we'd invested in, the ability to kill someone, find them and kill them in a pickup truck in the wilds of Helmand, and a bit of money into the nuclear deterrent. All we could do was kill people in upcountry Afghanistan and nuke Moscow. Everything else in between had atrophied.
As a response to 9/11, right? So that was the new war that we had to fight.
We didn't order a frigate for 17 years. And then, funnily enough, they've all gone out of date at the same moment. So that's the mess that they're in. They've got to recapitalize. And coming back, the Ukrainian examples, and what was it? Extraordinarily important in terms of inspiration, but the Ukrainians themselves would say, my Lord, the speed at which it moves. The first year of the war, we became obsessed with producing 2 million artillery shells, because artillery was the big killer again, as it had been in the Second World War, and they needed them. And it was a real struggle. Europe had a plan to do 1 million. The Americans... Both sides really struggled, but we got there, by which point the Ukrainians were saying, oh no, drones are killing 75% of people on the battlefield now. They sort of do still need them, but not nearly as many. And so even in the course of those last 2-3 years, we've seen what Ukraine wants from us change quite fundamentally. Now, think about replacing warships in 2035 or something. That to get it right... Can I ask you a really dumb question? It's possible to fly an airliner, an Airbus A320 that's 30 years old, and everyone feels safe on that plane. Why do frigates after a certain age, I don't know what it is, 15 years, 20 years, why are they no longer fit for purpose? Yeah, it's a really good question. The one that... I hope you know the answer. They've been going out of commission like 2 this year already from a total of only 6 that were still in commission, they sometimes refer to in the fleet as the Skoda, because they claim it was really cheaply built, etc., etc. The answer is, if you reinvested sufficiently, you would be able to keep it in service for a lot longer. Look at those American B-52 bombers. They're certainly well over 50 years old, the whole fleet. Now, warships you can reinvest, but what normally happens is that nexus, let's just call it the military-industrial triangle or complex or whatever, that says, we need more orders in Glasgow. Says, no. The cost of refurbing all those frigates would be, 3 billion. The cost of buying some new ones would be 5 billion. Let's buy the new ones. And that's what happens time and again with that system of procurement. Lindsey, you spend a lot of time in Ukraine and a lot of time also on the front line in Donbass. Describe to us what drone warfare feels like when you're on the ground. Look, I feel as I've watched the nature of warfare change since, when I first went to Ukraine was in 2014, when, the Russians arrived, the little green men arrived at the airport in Crimea. And the first shots were fired at Belbek Air Base, where the Ukrainians refused to stand down, and the Russian irregulars came and forced them to surrender. But so in November 2022, we were in a trench, and there's a Russian sniper overhead who was 500 meters away. Now nobody's in a trench, because the reason for a trench is to be down and the sniper goes over your head. We weren't really in any great danger. It was very muddy and there were rats. But now you're in a dugout far below the ground, and you're there with a few people playing video games on a screen.
And it's because you'd be mad to go into a trench, because if you were in a trench,
You'd be visible,
they can come down and get you, drop something straight down on you. So the battlefield has completely changed.
But also, is the battlefield in the air divorced from the battlefield on the ground, so much so that even if how do you occupy territory? How do you move the front line?
Well, no, that is the critical question, which is why I don't think that the situation we're in at the moment, which you could call stasis or stalemate or whatever, quite analogous in some ways to the World War I. Yeah. I don't think that can persist. I mean, it's effectively as when your means of killing people have become so much more effective than your means of moving or protecting them, that everyone just ends up stuck. And it was interesting to see an interview with the Ukrainian military boss, General Syrski, who sort of said, this was 2 days ago, he sort of said, at the moment we have no use for armoured vehicles on the battlefield. But we will, because we'll come up with a better system for protecting them. Now, some people talk about putting little turrets with lasers on the top of armoured vehicles. We don't really know what that improved type of protection for vehicles will be, but lots of different technologies are being worked on.
But can I just come back to one thing which I think is really critical in this, when that is the human factor, it's the people. So the Ukrainians are at the moment doing better than they were. I think it's too early to say whether they've turned the tide. Now, that is partly because they are innovating more quickly than the Russians. However, what Ukrainians will always tell you is that whenever we do anything, the Russians then catch up. It's cat and mouse. But I was talking to a military expert yesterday who was saying, but it's also about the caliber of people. So Ukraine is quite a high technology society. There are lots of people, men and women, who are very good at this stuff. And the Russians, they are still recruiting mainly from the much poorer parts of the country, people who have very little education. And they do not have either the technical skills to operate these very advanced drones, nor the infantry skills which are needed to go to infiltrate the front line, to go into this vast area, which is now completely covered in fiber optic cable, and do the things that they need to do, escape an invasion, infiltration, go over enemy lines, fire their drones that way, the short-range drones and so on. They don't have those skills. And that is why the Ukrainians are killing, apparently, and this is really awful, 30 to 40,000 Russian soldiers a month, which the Russians cannot replace. It's too fast to replace them. So then you come back to the most basic of warfare, which has been true since time immemorial, which is that you have to kill one more person than the enemy.
But just on the casualties, so they think the number of people killed, Russian soldiers killed, a conservative estimate is 352,000 since the beginning of the big military operation.
Yes.
I mean, 4.5 years ago, right? 352,000. There were 14,000 Soviet servicemen who were killed in 10 years of occupation of Afghanistan. And that was a brutal war that brought down the Soviet, helped to bring down the Soviet empire, right? So these are extraordinary numbers. Then, the number of people maimed, life-changing injuries. I mean, twice as many. So maybe that's another 700,000. Who knows what the actual numbers are? Who knows what they are on the Ukrainian side? But I just think but again, getting back to your earlier point, why is the quality of Ukrainian soldiers that much smarter? It's because, first of all, they're not afraid to recruit smart people from the big cities, unlike
whereas
the Kremlin.
the Russians,
and also, they know what they're fighting for, right? They know exactly what they're fighting for. Whereas if you're a guy who's been brought in from Dagestan, you will get quite handsomely paid while you're still alive. But what is the reason you're doing it? Is it to protect Vladimir Putin? Is it to resurrect the Russian world, Ruski Mir? I mean, they're all over the shop, as we know from Trump and Iran. If you don't have an overwhelming reason for going into conflict, that is the biggest thing, the biggest handicap you have while you're fighting it.
My corrective there would be, of course, Putin is still fighting. He does not seem to, his calculus does not seem to have been changed by these hundreds of thousands of dead. B, they have innovated themselves at sufficient speed to keep the Ukrainians on their toes. And if you go back a year, the tactical position was much better for them because they had adopted the fiber optic first-person drone
Explain that, by the way, to our audience.
Can I just say
literally
something about
a little
fibre optic?
cable spools out
Yes.
for up to 25 kilometres
Yes.
behind the drone so that you can't jam it.
Right.
Because it's literally connected by cable to an
Can I tell you
operator.
something about those cables? They are now finding birds' nests on the front
Made of
line
cables.
Made of
of fibre
amazing.
optic cable.
Yeah. There we go. That was an
the
innovation,
Russians-
which now the Ukrainians have done as well, presumably,
Yeah.
right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
they've done
They've
the same
adopted them, but they now accuse the Chinese of preferentially selling longer spools of fibre optic to the Russians. But I mean, look, it's a cat and mouse game, as you said, of innovation and counter innovation. And to me, in a way, the most extraordinary paradox about the Russian war effort is that you've got that sort of awful lumpen, ex-con, drunken, middle-aged contract soldier stumbling to a near certain death. I mean, we heard some extraordinary figures or extrapolations last week. Within a couple of weeks of arriving on the front, they'll be gone. And then you do have people in that system, particularly in the officers and the defence industry, who are smart cookies and are innovating very successfully on drones and on electronic warfare.
Yeah.
But I mean, the Ukrainians undoubtedly have sown the seeds over the past 2 or 3 years of all kinds of programs that are now producing volume in terms of those long range beyond the battlefield, which I think really is changing the calculus. Now, does it change? We talked about it, didn't we, last week? Does that change it in the wrong way, that it causes Putin to escalate because he is losing fuel depots, he's losing the ability to get supplies through to Crimea?
Well, Nina Khrushcheva thought it did.
Yes, last
There are
week.
lots of people you speak to say, actually, he'd just be bluffing. But what's happening in Crimea is really interesting, isn't it? Because they are effectively cutting it off.
Yes.
And, Crimea is supposed to be, we don't know this, or many of us who haven't been there, but it's got lovely beaches. This is the Riviera that the Soviet Union used to go to when they could. And this is where the Russians went in recent years after 2014. And now they've got this thing, I read, I think it was in The Economist, they've stopped using these sirens because there are so many incoming drones that the sirens would go off literally round the clock. And the holidaymakers from Moscow have complained about the noise. So they just put up with explosions somewhere in the distance. And the only place that is safe now to have a swim in Crimea is Yalta, because there are no military installations there. So you can still dip into the water in Yalta, have a wonderful swim, but anywhere else on that lovely coastline, you're going to be in trouble. I mean, fuel shortages, fuel rationing in Crimea. So is it possible that the Ukrainians think they can get Crimea back? And what would that blow mean to Vladimir Putin in Moscow?
Well, I think that before you get to whether they can take it back militarily, which I think is quite dubious, you look at what the impact is on Russian society. I was watching, would you believe this, a Russian influencer in Crimea who was sort of going around her holiday flat in Sevastopol or wherever it was, and going, this isn't very nice. I was coming here on a great holiday, and now I think I'm going to have to leave. But how am I going to get out? Because the queues to leave are miles and miles long.
Is the Kerch Bridge closed?
The Kerch Bridge, I'm not sure if the Kerch Bridge is closed, but the other two ways of getting in have been completely blocked. And you can't, that sort of setback is hard to keep secret. And they don't want.
And Putin has admitted that there is a setback.
Yes, he's admitted that there's fuel shortages.
Yeah.
And he actually admitted, quite interestingly, he said that, this is, the Ukrainians trying to sap our morale in order to put us into a disadvantageous situation so that we come to the negotiating table, which is absolutely true.
Yeah.
But also there's, Crimea is where there's an awful lot of military installations and an awful lot of the Russian war effort in Ukraine. Their sort of logistics hubs and so on are in Crimea. So it's very important for them. Whether the Ukrainians could actually ever take it again, I don't know. What do you think, Mark?
Well, for all the reasons we were talking about how hard it is to move across contested ground now with these swarms of drones and, the unblinking eye of all these different kinds of surveillance, I think it would be extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to take it military. Absent a sort of, 1917 style collapse of the Russian army in which people just stop fighting and but I don't think we're there yet.
Okay, so let me ask you this, Mark. If, let's say, actually both of you, but let's imagine that by the end of this year, there is some kind of resolution to the Ukraine conflict. Either it's an armistice, like after the Korean War, the war's not resolved, but there's, the front line is frozen. There's a DMZ where even more birds' nests can be built somewhere in the Donbass. But we don't feel they don't feel the threat. And as you percolate away from the front line, the threat is felt less and less. What happens to that defense plan under Prime Minister Andy Burnham, who's also got to spend a ton of money on education? He's still got the welfare crowd breathing down his neck in Parliament, et cetera, et cetera. Suddenly, do they say, you know what, the 2.7 billion, let's bring that back down to 2.65?
So if you go back to the Defence Review and the fact that they didn't want to put numbers on it initially, and then they went for a little increase over the first 2 years. They were in the middle of that.
Yeah.
There were people on the Defence Review who said to me quite straightforwardly, we cannot get the Treasury to talk about anything more than 2 years in advance. And the reason is because they're hoping that the war in Ukraine will end, that Trump will be out of the White House, and that then we can row back on some of the, we won't have the same urgency. So undoubtedly there are people in Whitehall who would like to exploit that possibility.
And Chancellor Ed Miliband, if he gets the job, is very keen on the Green Revolution.
Well, he is.
Which is something that has been parked, in the long grass by Keir Starmer.
That's key to why John Healey resigned. Is his point was, I think he used in his resignation letter the phrase backloaded. In other words, they don't want to spend the money, make the increases soon. They want to leave them all for down the road. In other words, if the situation changes, they may welch out of them. And anyway, it's another parliament after 2030. It's another government's problem. So he wanted them to spend money sooner.
Lindsey, you've just been to China. We always say China's got, spending more money on defense than anyone else. And they've got this amazing technology that you were able to participate in, not war technology, but civilian technology. But what I want to know about, I'm fascinated by China because we don't talk about it enough. What's their understanding of a potential war, either with the West over Taiwan or maybe with Taiwan itself? Does that enter into the kind of public mind, and do they think they're well prepared for any kind of military conflict?
Yeah, they're certainly trying to get well prepared, but one of the things which is very interesting is that Xi Jinping has got rid of all of his leading generals for allegedly for corruption, and that may be true, but also for disloyalty. And so there is a sense in which the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, for all that it is the biggest army in the world and for all that it is becoming the best equipped, is also somewhat in disarray at the moment. So I don't see China wanting to move very quickly on any kind of war front. But I think that most analysts who I speak to see, and this comes back to the backloading issue on British defence, see China and Russia as long-term threats,
right? Not
as necessarily as short-term threats, as long-term threats. And certainly the Europeans, I think, would see Russia as a long-term threat. But the whole nature of warfare is changing, and this is where some of this talk of battleships and so on looks worried. It looks outdated. What is the biggest weapon? The biggest weapon is data.
Yeah.
So how do we get our data here? Well, it's all undersea cables, isn't it? 99% of our data comes from undersea. We're an island. And so, yes, some of these ships and so on that you're talking about and submarines will be about protecting undersea cables, but it's one of the most worrying things. And also with that goes, our infrastructure, the grid, the electricity grid. This is the warfare of the future. Bringing down the British electricity grid would probably, and with it, the internet, your washing machine, the lights, all of this. These are probably the most acute threats that we are potentially facing.
And this is, and you talk to people like Fiona Hill, who we've had on the podcast as well. She says we are already in this state of war.
Yeah, she thinks that we're already in a state of war.
Just one quick example, Jaguar Land Rover, right, completely flawed in their operations last year. We now know that was a Russian hack.
Yeah.
They totally messed with their software and essentially benched one of our biggest companies for months, losing
and took
millions of quid.
A fraction of a percentage point off our economy, didn't it?
And this is about what they call resilience, and Fiona talks a lot about this. And in the Defence Review, they talked about a lot of this. A whole of society resilience. So it's not a separate thing, that the military need to buy all this new kit. It's about how we protect our airports, how we protect all of our infrastructure. And that requires sort of all ministries, and as I know Fiona would argue, all of us to participate in
the
some
citizens.
way.
Yeah.
The citizens, yeah.
But we're not doing that, are we? I mean, do you feel as a citizen of this country that you're being made to feel aware about war?
Yeah, I think that there's a real problem with our sort of national traditions here, that we've always relied, apart from the two Great World Wars, on small cadres of professionals to run our armed forces. The citizens don't have a long history of feeling involved. We don't have the sort of Swedish or Swiss concept of citizens' defence in which everyone is trained, or the Finns, can put an army of 250,000 in the field in 3 days. Extraordinary. So we don't have those traditions, and I think that's quite hard. And once again, to bring some of our themes together, I was talking to the head of the Dutch Armed Forces a couple of months ago, and he said, I do have a plan that tells me what the country will be spending on defence over the next 10 years to get to that NATO target. Exactly what we still don't actually have for the British Armed Forces. And B, they have started programs, civil defence programs for citizen volunteers. He said there's been a huge public response. You can teach people all kinds of stuff, from first aid to how you deal with collapsed buildings and rescue people, which of course has many uses. It's not just about the ultimate nightmare scenario.
Or conscription, which we talk about here, national service.
But you see, this is very interesting. So the generals who I was listening to at the weekend, one of them was talking about the Norwegian model, which is very interesting because it's not conscription. It's not like the Danes who conscript, who you have to do a military service. But they look to the universities, the schools and so on, and then to industry, and they say, okay, we need 100,000 of the best in these particular skills, which are obviously these days data, internet, drones, all of that kind of stuff. And it's it's well paid, and it's seen as a very prestigious thing to do. It's not like, oh, damn, I've got to go and paint a wall with the smallest possible paintbrush like it used to be when the French had conscription. No, this is something which is going to really help you on your career. This is something for the highest achievers.
Thank you very much to all of you for listening yet again to the Fourcast Indicators.